This is a broadsword. But why do some swords have broad blades? Do they serve any purpose at all? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, while I'm using some 18th century basket-hilted broadswords and backswords for the purposes of this video, this applies to all types of sword. It doesn't matter where in the world or what period of history you're looking at. And here we've got two particularly broad examples of 18th century broadswords. These are both double-edged, they are broad, they both have basket hilts. This one is British government, that one is probably Scottish. These are the sort of Jacobite period, so if you watch the show Outlander, that kind of period. But I've got some others here, I'm just going to put those carefully down, and these are from the same period, these are also basket hilts, but these are both back swords, and you will notice that they are narrower. They're narrower at the centre of percussion, which is the portion of the blade that you hit with, and they're narrower at the base as well. Now, the fact that the two broader ones are broader and also double-edged, and the fact that the narrower ones are single-edged does have some relevance, but we're going to come back to that a little bit later in the video. For now, I want to just discuss, is there any benefit to having a broader blade at the striking portion of the blade up here? Well, clearly some people in history thought so, or perhaps observed that there was, and we're going to look at why in a second. So this is a standard width Victorian officer's sabre. Okay, so that is about 1 inch and an 1/8 wide. Okay, so you can notice just over 1 inch wide at the centre of percussion. But what I've got here is another example which is deliberately very, very broad. Okay, so I'm just going to take this out here, and you can hopefully see on camera instantly, this is actually a naval officer's sword. It's extremely wide, and this was ordered from Wilkinson's sword to be extremely wide. And in fact, this is more cutlass proportions, no coincidence that it's a naval officer's sword. But clearly the person that ordered this sword went into Wilkinson's and said, make mine an extra wide one please, because he wanted to have a wider blade. So is it actually beneficial for anything? Well, the answer is yes. Broader blades do cut better, but maybe not for the reasons that you think. If I just take this narrower blade here, so this is an unusual sword in that it kind of looks like a small sword, but it does actually have a cut and thrust blade. So this has a flattened hexagonal cross-section blade, but you'll notice, of course, like small swords or most rapiers, it's pretty narrow. That's not to say, therefore, it can't cut. It can cut to some degree, but it's never going to be able to cut through the sort of targets that this big broadsword can cut through. And I think most people realise that instinctively. But why is it? Well, it comes down to mass, okay? So people tend to look at a sword as one whole object and consider its mass in total. So say, for example, this sword here weighs about 600, 700 grams. And so they consider that as an object that's hitting a target. But of course it's not. It's a lever. It has rotational points. So when we're actually moving a sword, the back of the sword, which is actually where most of the mass is, isn't really moving very much. You might be extending the arm. It might be traveling towards the target like this. But fundamentally, most of the rotational velocity is coming towards the centre of percussion, the part of the blade that you're actually going to cut with. And so actually it's a little bit like a projectile. So when we're looking at the effect that a blade has on a target, we have to consider the amount of mass that is in quite a localised area. The amount of mass that's in the hilt has almost no relevance whatsoever to hitting the target. Hitting the target is really a function of the amount of mass that is at the end of the lever, a bit like if you imagine a mace where you've got a long lever and a weight at the end, or a hammer. It is the weight of the head which is relevant to how much energy is being transferred to the target. So therefore a broader blade, which has more metal in it, is going to be hitting the target with more energy. But mass doesn't always have to be a function of width. It can be formed in different ways. And so I've just grabbed this antique katana here in Handachi mounts, very nice thing it is too, and this has a relatively narrow blade. It's a similar width to the Victorian officer's sword we looked at a moment ago, but katanas are thick with a double C at the end. So these have quite a lot of mass towards the end of the blade. So just put the sire down carefully for a second. Anybody who has handled a antique katana, or indeed a good quality replica katana, will instantly feel that these are blade heavy weapons. Although the total mass might be relatively light, it might only weigh 900 grams. A lot of the concentration of the mass, unlike something like a basket hilted broadsword where a lot of the mass is actually down towards the hand in the handguard, with a katana there's very little mass down towards the hand. When you feel the sword in your hand, it feels like it wants to strike, it feels like it wants to hit, because these are thick, very rigid blades. I won't say they're inflexible, because of course you can flex them and a katana will stay bent. It doesn't flex like a European sword does. But they have a lot of mass at the centre of percussion. That means that when we swing this as a lever and you're hitting the target, you have quite a lot of mass. In other words, a bit like a pendulum or as I say, a projectile, which is hitting the target. So we're delivering mass at the target. Just the same as with a broad blade, but we're forming that mass in a slightly different way with a thick blade, even though it's not particularly broad. Now, of course, having more mass at the tip comes at a price, at a cost, and that is that this sword is going to be less nimble. If we take something like a tapered blade here, like a rapier or walloon or whatever else, it's going to be more nimble in the hand. And so things like military officers' sabres are a kind of middle ground. And in fact, most medieval arming swords and longswords are a middle ground. They're not hugely broad at the centre of percussion, but they're broader than a typical rapier is, so they have good cutting capacity while also remaining nimble. A sword like this, which happens to be a very large cavalry sword, to some extent isn't for fencing, it isn't even for use on foot really, although you could use it on foot. It is a big cleaving sword to be used from horseback. So this is a kind of specialised tool, and in fact many arming swords from the age of chivalry, from the 12th, 13th and into the 14th centuries, have big cleaving blades because they're designed to be used from horseback, not necessarily designed to be nimble on foot. That changes with time, of course, and they do get more tapered blades, but the fact is that this is a particular kind of tool for a particular job, but it comes at a cost. So the question here is, why is a similar sword from a similar time, also cavalry, also 18th century, also British, more tapered? Well, a number of reasons. Firstly, this is a more nimble sword. So if you want a more nimble version of the sword, you have to give up some of the striking capacity and give up mass towards the tip. But in addition, I mentioned cross-section, I mentioned the fact that this is a double-edged broadsword, and this is a single-edged backsword. Now, backswords are interesting because by sacrificing having one edge, or sacrificing one of the two edges, if you want to look at it like that, so they completely blunt on the back and only got an edge on the front, much like the katana that we just looked at, it means that you can have the mass at the back and you can have a nice slender edge geometry to the edge because you're not trying to squeeze two edges out of that shape. With a double-edged sword, like this one here, we've got to have an edge bevel at the back, an edge bevel at the front, and therefore the thickest portion of the blade is in the middle. But generally speaking, in order to get that blade to be relatively rigid, we have to make it broader. So the way that double-edged blades and single-edged blades are made are by necessity somewhat different, and it's more difficult to make a double-edged blade narrow without making it thick at the middle. If you make it thick at the middle and it's that broad, it would be too heavy. Things like rapiers are thicker at the middle, but of course they're narrower, which keeps them light. So it's all about shifting the material around, the mass around, to where you want it to achieve more nimbleness or more striking power. But there's another element which often gets overlooked, and that is if you have to have a certain thickness in the spine in order to create a certain degree of rigidity to the blade, that means that the angle at which the bevel has to get to that maximum thickness, let's say the thickness is 5mm, to get to 5mm, if it has to do it across a short distance, for example in a narrow blade, then the edge angle has to be thicker or broader, a bigger angle essentially. Whereas a very broad blade like this, to get to that same 5mm, it's got longer or further to do it, and so therefore the edge angle can be more shallow, and this creates a better edge geometry for a cutting blade because you end up with a more shallow edge, approaching something like a kitchen knife, whereas something like this is more like a chisel edge. And clearly a broader edge angle is never going to pass through a resisting target as easily as a fine or narrow edge angle. So is there any advantage to having a broad blade? Yes, absolutely. It increases striking power. And anybody that does HEMA, for example, and gets hit by something like a 1796 simulator compared to a Spadroon simulator will easily be able to tell you the 1796 hits harder, and that's for a whole range of reasons, including where the point of balance is and other things, but a big function of it is how much mass is behind the centre of percussion. And remember, the total mass is more or less irrelevant, or at least not very relevant. The most relevant element is how much mass is in the portion that is actually hitting you, the centre of percussion. And broad edges enable you to have a finer edge because they have more distance over which to get to that maximum spine thickness, and therefore the edge angle can be less, so they're more likely to cut more effectively as well. But remember, it always comes at a cost. So yes, you can make a falchion which cuts like an absolute monster. However, if you're going to do that, then you might find that the sword is not very nimble, and it was great at chopping, but it's not very good at actually fighting with or defending yourself with. And everything's a trade-off at the end of the day. And remember also that single edge versus double edge also changes it. And generally speaking, very broad blades, not always, because there's exceptions like the Chinese Dao and the falchion and things like that. You can have a very broad blade that's single-edged, and that actually gives you can have an even shallower edge angle, because instead of the edge angle having to get to its maximum thickness at the middle of the blade, it's actually got the back of the blade, so you can have a very fine edge on something like a Dao or a falchion or a Mesa. But generally speaking, there is some degree of difference between single-edged or double-edged, and very often we can find that we can achieve very good edge geometry without too much width or mass with a single-edged blade, for example in a katana or a backsword. Anyway, there we go. I hope that's something to mull over, but remember that the mass that's most important is the mass around the portion of the centre of percussion that's actually hitting you, not the total mass of the sword. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I'll be back on the channel really soon, so make sure you watch out for my next video. Take care, folks.